Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I'm your host, Rex Bear, and we have guest Jim Elvidge with us, an electrical engineer, author, researcher, holding 4 patents. Now, behind and beyond the high-tech realm, Mr. Elvidge has years of experience as a musician, writer, and truth seeker. He merged his technology skills with his love of music, developed one of the first PC-based digital music samplers, and co-founded Radio Amp, the first private label online streaming radio company. And for many years, Mr. Elvidge has kept pace with the latest research, theories, and discoveries in the varied fields of subatomic physics, cosmology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and the paranormal. This unique knowledge has provided the foundation for his first full-length book, The Universe Solved. Pick up your copy today at theuniversesolved.com. Hey, Jim, it's great to have you on the show with us here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Thank you very much, Rex. Great to be on the project. I'm doing great and really looking forward to our conversation tonight.
Absolutely. You know, I was telling you a little bit before the show started, I've always been a big fan of the possibility of this specific reality that we're in being a type of simulation, almost like virtual reality. And I'll just give you games and just thinking, man, what is this going to be like 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road? And then when the virtual reality stuff got out there, I had access to some specific VR, and just the possibilities I realized were incredible. And I thought, is this what the future of our life is going to be like, similar to that movie that Bruce Willis was in, also the Avatar film? You look at sacred geometry and other things. There's just so many things that point to the possibility of this being a simulation. So I'm certainly just feel honored to have you on the show, and I know that our listeners are going to be enthralled in this information. And if you could just give us a brief description about yourself and background, and then we'll segue into The Universe Solved.
Okay, sure. I really do appreciate the interest in the area, and sometimes I wonder if we're thinking about this and all of this interest now in the simulated theories and simulism and so forth. I have to do with the fact that there is virtual reality out there, that we do have fantasy games that we can play that are very immersive and almost indistinguishable from reality. And we start thinking, well, what if our reality is like that? You know, how much of it is, kind of the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, or how much of it is really real? So I've always got that in the back of my head when I think about these things and when I do research, trying to make sure that I'm not coming to conclusions through the lens of the technology that we have today. But, it has just opened up those possibilities and leads to some kind of interesting logical arguments too. So yeah, okay, a little bit about me. Electrical engineering, my focus area in school was digital signal processing, which was kind of interesting because that's a lot about what we talk about here. And my day job is something very different. I do leadership coaching and agile coaching, helping high-tech companies be more efficient and be more empowered and things like that. But this side project of The Universe Solved and the book that I'm working on now, there's a second book, has really been my passion. So I've been researching this for many years and kind of keeping up with other people who have been researching this. We've been in touch, and back in the days when I came out the book, it's not that long ago, back in 2008, there were only 3 or 4 of us, and now there are probably hundreds who are talking about this concept and coming at it from different angles. So in a way, it's really good to see kind of mainstream science considering this seriously and jumping on the bandwagon. So that's an interesting development.
That's right. I do remember reading a headline of an article, and it was on one of the more popular news channels, talking about the scientists came out and said that we're most likely in some type of simulation. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, let's go to the heart of the matter then. What would make somebody, the first step that would make somebody go, wow, there is certainly a possibility that this isn't just what I thought it was growing up or what I was told?
Well, the first step is actually probably the biggest and most important one, but it's not for the faint of heart. It's the researching quantum mechanics. It's a field of science that was essentially one of the 2 revolutionary fields of physics in the 20th century, relativity being the other one. Relativity was all about what happens at very high speeds and how space is warped and time is dilated and all these kind of things. And Einstein was a genius for coming up with that theory and the implications of it. And it's been proven out over and over again to be a very accurate and solid theory. The other one being quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics, in contrast, is focusing on the very small, what happens at very tiny scales. And very early on, there was a lot of debate about, is our space quantized? Is time quantized? Do things kind of chunk along and, in little units of time? And scientists, split camps. There were some that believed, no, space is continuous and time is continuous. And then there were others that said, no, maybe not. Maybe there is some kind of digital nature to it. So there have been a lot of experiments developed to kind of probe the nature of reality. And the main one is it's a class of experiments called the double slit experiment. And the fascinating thing about this experiment is that the results of the experiment, the outcome of it, is a pattern on a screen. And that pattern changes depending on whether or not you observe it. So that sort of implies that the observer, the conscious entity that is watching this experiment, is interacting with it in some way. The very fact that it's observing causes reality to change, or actually causes something to come into reality. So this has been a baffling idea for years, and there have been no end of interpretations of quantum mechanics, 15, 20 different ones that have tried to explain this away. And over the years, different experiments get better and better and rule out all of the kind of continuous reality, deterministic reality possibilities, until we're now left with some experiments that don't actually determine the direction that these particles go until after the pattern is created, and that determination then effectively changes the pattern. So it's impossible for the observer to interfere with the experiment. It's just noticed afterwards. So there's an experiment called the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, which pretty much puts a nail in the coffin of determinism and deterministic reality. And what it means is, the real aha moment is, oh my gosh, we're actually creating our reality. And that old thing where they say, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? According to quantum mechanics, no, it doesn't. You have to have an observer there to notice anything at all. So that's really the astounding result. And there are a lot of other categories of evidence, which I talk about in the book and talk about in my new book and on my blog as well. But that double slit experiment, the quantum mechanics results, those are the things that generate the headlines that say we must be living in a simulated reality.
It's interesting you say there has to be an observer for something to take place, essentially. And everything alive is observing to an extent with some type of sensory perception, whether it be a bug, plant. So I'm wondering then, if this quantum makeup that we're in, this matrix per se, kind of like the movie, this holographic soup, essentially we're all connected somewhere. So in this simulation, it's constantly running software basically, and that's kind of connected to our DNA. So is that how we basically see what we do, through the software that's being immersed through the actual physical body?
Right. Really good question. And, we're jumping right into it here. This is great. I'll back up just a second and say that there could be kind of two schools of thought on this simulation idea. One is that we're in one, playing it somehow, connected to it like an avatar, and we're just going along for the ride, and it's deterministic. The other school of thought is very different. It's the one that I subscribe to, which is it's not deterministic. It's our consciousness is elsewhere. Our consciousness doesn't emanate from the brain. It's somewhere else. So I believe, from all of the evidence that I've collected and researched, that what some of the ancient mystics said, being that we're all connected into one global consciousness, some people might call it God, some people might call it the universe or universal consciousness or whatever, that we are all part of that. And a section of it defines each one of us. The bug, the human, whatever. There's a section of that thing, and you can think of it as having sort of a virtual wall around it that makes it individuated. That's our consciousness. That's our mind, and it's interacting most likely with another programmatic construct that's in this great big ball of consciousness as well. I call it all that there is. It's just digital stuff. So we interact with this other thing that has templates for humans and templates for brains and templates for bugs and cats and dogs and so forth. And we appear to connect to that and interact with reality in what we think of as physical reality in that way, but it's all very virtual. So that's what makes everything soft. We have, if you think about the nature of a reality, what is a reality? A reality is something that you experience, and people experience all kinds of realities. You experience a certain reality when you dream. but that's just you. That's one person. So a lot of people would say, "Oh, well, that's just a fantasy." Okay, fine. My mind is making that up, and I'm interacting in that world. That's fine. But over at the other extreme is what we call a very high consensus reality, and that's one where a lot of conscious entities, yourself, myself, all the people around us, are experiencing largely the same thing. We stand on a street corner and we watch a blue car go by, and we all say, "Hey, that's blue. Is it blue to you?" "Yeah, it is. It's going pretty fast." We all kind of agree on what we see. But these experiments that I was talking about before are showing that in reality, we don't experience exactly the same thing. And we, create things. So there's this very complex thing going on with all of these consciousnesses experiencing things, and the, kind of clay that is the digital reality responding accordingly. In the middle of that spectrum, I talk about the consensus reality at one end and the kind of individual reality of a dream state in the other end. There's actually other things in between. So, like an out of body experience, there have been people who have had out of body experiences where they've interacted with other people having out of body experiences, written down what they saw, written down their interactions with each other, and found out that they were all consistent. Or people who have had mutual lucid dreams, which is very similar. So, there's really a whole spectrum of types of reality, some low consensus, some high consensus. The fact that we're normally in this high consensus reality makes us think that it's really hard and solid, but deep down it isn't.
Now, as far as the movie goes, I know you make some references in the beginning of your book about the Matrix, and you just kind of talked about reality as basically somebody's perception. So does that mean that after this life form, that our consciousness basically goes into a reset or just into another vessel? What have you done much research into that aspect of it?
Oh yeah, sure, and that's pretty much half of the theory. The book, The Universe Solved, doesn't explore that too much. It identifies a couple of possibilities, but since then, my research has gotten a lot more into the nature of consciousness and the nature of how conscious entities interact, and so forth. So the problem here is that a lot of this isn't, quote, scientific in the sense that it's, repeatable evidence and so forth, but anecdotal evidence actually is scientific. Fields of psychology and others can't rely on repeatable experiments. They rely on, asking questions and talking to humans about their experiences and deriving theories from that. So if you kind of open up the spectrum of science and look at a lot of the information that's available on things like near-death experiences, mystical experiences, out-of-body experiences, all these kinds of alternate realities that millions of people have, and not just in the United States, but all over the world, every culture, and all throughout time, they all have very consistent experiences, and those experiences basically say that when we die, we do go to a non-physical reality where we interact with other entities, and we create a new life, and we check back into the physical reality and reincarnate. Essentially, there's even a lot of great reincarnation evidence that's almost irrefutable. So you put all this together and you realize that what the ancient mystics said was accurate, what quantum mechanics is saying is accurate, and it really kind of ties together in this really amazing theory.
Right. Now, free will also is very controversial. Some people feel they have it, some think they don't. What is your synopsis on that?
I think we do have free will, and I'll quote Tom Campbell here. Tom, I don't know if you're familiar with Tom, his work,
My Big Toe?
My Big Toe, great guy and really astounding book. Can't recommend it enough. So he kind of talks about how free will is part and parcel to consciousness itself. It's part of the fabric of consciousness. So it's more of an assumption that there is free will. If there isn't free will and we're just all following some predetermined thing, that it's almost pointless. Science is even pointless. And so from one extent you can say we don't even want to talk about something where there's no free will, but in another way you can kind of derive the fact that there's free will just from the fact that there is consciousness. If there isn't consciousness, we wouldn't be making decisions. We wouldn't be creating reality the way these quantum mechanics experiments tell us that we are. So it seems to be part of the very fabric of reality.
And I think that's good to hear because I've talked to others that think the exact opposite. They feel everything is predetermined and predestined, and that's kind of sad, in my opinion. I
Oh, I
mean,
do too.
what's
Yeah,
the
and
point of that?
it's not that, we want to believe in something that makes us feel good, but it really does. It really does seem that there has to be free will. I mean, in fact, John Bell, physicist, in 1964, he developed a theorem that argued that there were certain quantum correlations, like entanglement, that have to violate realism or locality or free will. And he ruled out certain possibilities of hidden variables and things like that Einstein envisioned. But as these experiments got kept on evolving, they seem to imply that local realism is false and free will exists. So even the very deep science in the quantum mechanics world seems to infer that free will exists.
Yeah, okay. Now, as far as the mind goes, a lot of people think that it's your brain. Some people say it's your consciousness, but where exactly is it?
Well, this is where I say it's in this kind of global space, in this global consciousness. Tom Campbell refers to it as an individuated consciousness within the larger system. The larger system is all that there is. It's all that we know exists, and so that I think of it in a way like we do have this brain, which again is a template. If we're really an avatar, it's a template, but it's a template that has to respond to things. So, take an example of, let's say you're playing a video game and you have an avatar on the screen, and you want to pick up something and throw it. Well, if you don't have any arms, you can't very well pick that up and throw it and interact with that reality, that virtual reality on the screen. So you have to have your template, or your body has to be able to support the kind of things that you need to do. In a much more detailed and complex way, the structure of our brain has to also support the kind of things that we do when we interact with our virtual world, the way that we do. So yeah, we need the brain, we need the complexity of it, but just because somebody puts some electrodes in the brain and notices that when somebody wakes up, there's a lot of activity, doesn't mean that consciousness comes from the brain. I could make the same argument about my TV. I could put a probe on the TV and say, oh, hey, when I change the channel, the patterns of this electricity changes, so therefore the programming must be generated by the TV. No, not really. The programming is generated somewhere else and comes through the network into the TV, which renders it and makes us experience it. It's pretty much probably the way that our mind works.
Now, I don't know if you've done much research into the Sumerian tablets, the way that they were translated by Zachariah Sitchin and others.
A little bit. I read one or two of his books and kind of looked into that.
The only reason I bring that up is because I've talked to a gentleman by the name of Gerald Clark. He's been on the show a few times here at the Leak Project, and he's very knowledgeable in, basically, I call it the genealogy of the gods. He can put a reference point and a name on, where Marduk came from, and he can put that connections to the Greek mythos and other religions and such. So he's pretty good at that, and better than anybody that I've ever talked to. And he thinks that these god forms that come back to Earth are actually avatars from these really almost demigod-like space beings, these Anunnaki. And I've thought about that, that possibility. Do you think that might be something that would be accurate, like these godlike beings that are, or maybe not even godlike, just very powerful and old and have long lifespans where they can do these virtual reality things and come back into this because it's like a virtual reality for them?
Yeah, I wouldn't rule that out. I wouldn't say that those are, the gods that our consciousness is part of. But the one thing that I could say is that the model that I have for how this all works makes it very possible to have metaphysical anomalies. So things like, so there are entities that don't exist in our normal reality, but they can be part of the reality. In other words, there's things that adhere to sort of, standard physics, a physics engine. But then there are things that don't, and there's no reason why they can't also exist in this thing that we largely we call a reality learning lab. That's our construct that we're living in. Think, if you saw the movie The Matrix, remember, Neo learned how to kind of defy the quote laws of physics. Well, theoretically, that's all possible. We all have to have something that roots us to feel like this reality is really real, or we wouldn't learn the things that we do. We wouldn't believe in it. We would think it was all a fantasy. And part of the whole reason for the reincarnations appear to be to evolve your consciousness through learning, through interacting with this. So where am I going with this? Meaning just that there can be other entities that don't follow those rules, that appear as gods or appear as aliens or something like that. That there's no reason why they can't exist in our reality, and be such that the average person doesn't see them or experience them. They're more anomalous. So this model makes that all very possible.
Okay. Now, I also know that you're very well versed in quantum physics, entanglement, etc. And I know just a little bit, and I'm sure some of our listeners know much more than I do, but could you describe exactly what that stuff is, like string theory, M theory?
Okay, sure. So a little bit about quantum mechanics. One of the big mysteries of quantum mechanics is this idea of entanglement, as you mentioned. And what has been observed, and is actually part of the quantum mechanics theory, is that when you bring particles very close together, or if they're generated in a sort of a nuclear reaction at the same time, and actually the way it seems to work is that when they're observed at the same time, they become entangled, which means that one particle does either the opposite of what the other one does, or in some way it's sort of in lockstep. Its behavior is in lockstep with the other particle. And you can take these particles and they've separated them by miles of distance. I know there was one experiment that was done between the Canary Islands and Italy, I think. So maybe hundreds of miles at this point. But theoretically, you can separate these things by light years, and they will instantaneously reflect each other. Now, this goes right back to that holographic theory that you were talking about, where Bohm sort of inferred that there was some implicate order, that everything was interconnected in a way that was sort of instantaneous, that underneath this reality there was some sort of instantaneous construct. But this has baffled people. It really baffled and bothered Einstein, because he said, well, one particle can't know what the other one's doing instantaneously, because that violates relativity. So, but this entanglement idea is very easily explained by the simulation model. And I'll just give you an example. So, remember I said that they found that our ability to observe something and measure something actually creates reality in some way. It actually changes reality. So imagine that what we're doing when we really peer deep into the kind of hypothetical microscope to look and see what's going on at that quantum level. And we create a couple particles, and we determine the features of those particles through whatever measurement equipment we have, whether it's cloud chambers or whatever. We determine the nature of those particles. What we're doing is we're locking them into reality. The fact that we make a measurement on them and determine their spin or determine their size or whatever means that we have now created them. Prior to that, they're sort of in probability space. They're potential. They have a potential to be there. And once we actually look at them, they lock in. Well, what's this is very similar to is the idea of something in computer science called a finite state machine. And a finite state machine it's just a piece of code, of software, that follows rules and changes state based on its input. So now if you imagine that what these particles really are representations of the particle in the finite state machine that is the digital reality underneath. And therefore, every single time that that computer or that system goes through its loop of taking all of the input and calculating the next state of the finite state machines, they all happen at the same time. So you can take a finite state machine of one particle and the finite state machine of another particle, and say in the virtual world we're separating them by 1,000,000 miles, but all they are is programmatic constructs which are getting executed at the same time. It completely explains what entanglement is. And so basically every anomaly in quantum mechanics that all these physicists are scratching their heads on, I've explained. I've explained them all in the blog. I explained them all in the book. And it's very consistent explanations. And every time a new one comes out, I'll write another blog to explain how it works. So that's a little bit about entanglement. String theory is a little different. String theory is sort of the next level down of reality, in the sort of physical world. So when we started breaking apart atoms, we got these subatomic particles, electrons and neutrons and things like that. And we found there were even more. There were mesons and pions and all kinds of neutrinos and all kinds of things there. So there is some theory that says, well, let's break those apart, and there must be some more fundamental um, aspect to the deep nature of matter, beyond these things. Something simple or something fundamental that explains all of this mess of particles. There's hundreds of them now, and that theory is string theory. It's really only a theory. It's a mathematical theory, but what it says is that every subatomic particle is a vibrating little bit of string, and the width of that string could be, I don't know, 10 to the minus 35th meters, some ridiculously small width. So it's practically one dimensional, but it just vibrates. And the frequency that it vibrates is what determines the nature of the particle. So in one, mathematical theory, they have the idea of a string, which is a fundamental component that can create all of these other particles. In order to make the math work, they've had to posit that there are really 10 or 11 dimensions, and I think that's where your M theory comes into place. It used to be 26 dimensions, and some of these are like curled up dimensions and things. So it gets incredibly complex. But the interesting thing to me is that if you look at the nature of matter, and I've written on this quite a bit, I like to look at trends because I think trends lead us to the truth. One of the trends we're seeing now is that there's a lot of evidence supporting a digital nature of reality, which I think therefore is indicative of the fact that we're on the right track. But the one trend that's kind of interesting about matter is that back in the old days, in the 1800s, we used to think that atoms were the ultimate building blocks of matter, that they were these solid, indivisible things. I think that's what atom means in Greek. It's indivisible. And so you jam them all together, and you got a bar of gold or whatever, and the only space there is the space in between these little billiard ball type things. So along comes Ernest Rutherford in the early 1900s, and he fires some particles at the center of one of these atoms and finds out that it bounces straight back, and others go right through. So he determines that the atom is actually mostly empty space, but it's composed of this tiny little nucleus with protons and neutrons, and it's surrounded by this electron cloud. So now, once he did that, there's the tenuousness of physical matter it's gotten like 20 orders of magnitude more tenuous. I forget what the numbers are, but it might be like 10 to 1 part physical stuff to something like 10 to the 20th parts empty space. But they didn't stop there. In the 1960s, they found out that these protons and neutrons were also mostly empty space, and they were composed of these 3 quarks that are smaller and denser. So now we're at, I think it was 1 part stuff to 10 to the 32 empty space, which is kind of like a grain of sand relative to the size of the Earth. And then string theory takes that and says, oh no, even the quarks are composed of just little tiny bits of string that are vibrating, and really even a quark is mostly empty space. So I think you see where I'm going, is that as we follow the trend of discovery of what matter is, it gets more and more tenuous. And I think we're going to find out at the end of the day that there really isn't any stuff at all. All matter is information. That's the direction that this is headed.
Right. I was just going to say, it sounds to me like there is no finite point, so everything is basically essentially hollow. Or maybe it's just that one neutron or that one quark, whatever, that's bouncing around so fast. It's just that one point that makes everything else exist because it's so fast. Who knows? I mean, just the possibilities. But I think that the information, what you said, everything is information, that does definitely resonate most with me. So that's incredible. And I really appreciate you kind of putting it together in a very easy way to understand. Now, as far as the holographic paradigm, this is obviously a really cool subject because there's that really good book that came out many years ago that we talked about a little bit before the show by Michael Talbot, The Holographic Universe Theory, and then he passed away a couple years after that book. But it just kind of opened up so many possibilities as this entire matrix being almost like a hologram. So do you think that that's the best way to describe this current form of reality?
It is a way, and I talk in the new book that I'm working on about models, and we think in terms of models. The idea of string theory is a model. It's a model of reality. The holographic universe idea is a model of reality. It's a model that says that underneath some layer of observable reality, everything is interconnected in some way, but it doesn't say how. So the holographic, I think of sort of if you kind of envision a stack of ideas. The holographic idea is pretty high up the stack. String theory is pretty low down the stack. quantum mechanics is maybe a little bit above string theory. But what I'm talking about is at the bottom of the stack. It's the real fundamental aspect of it. So what is that implicate order that Bohm talks about in the holographic theory, or Michael Talbot, the author of the book, refers to, that David Bohm, physicist, talks about? What is that implicate order? How are these things interconnected? Well, they're interconnected programmatically. They're interconnected in this big complex system that runs through a simulation incredibly fast, and taking everybody's conscious input into account and integrating it all together, and changing reality to the next state at a blazingly fast speed. And that's how everything is interconnected. So the holographic idea it's a good model for thinking about it, but what's really underneath is the stuff that I'm kind of diving into.
Great. So let's get into the nanotechnology. They're really getting advanced with that right now, too. I saw some stuff that was actually piggybacking off a bacteria that could get lodged into certain parts of the body and then do its work. Have you seen some pretty high-tech stuff with nano stuff as well?
Oh yeah, definitely. And this is an area that kind of fascinated me because I don't know if you're familiar with Eric Drexler's book. What was it called? Something about machines. So it was, essentially he was kind of the father of the nanotech idea. And it envisioned a future where things could be created a particle at a time. So like you think about a hamburger. Well, a hamburger is just, at the end of the day, I think it's just information. But even reductionist physicists would say, well, it's just atoms and it's just particles. So is the laptop sitting on my desk. Those are very different things. But the idea of nanotech is that you can actually create a laptop, theoretically, given a template and a program, and you can create a hamburger as well, if you know how to do that. So a lot of science fiction writers have taken this idea and talked about things like matter compilers and so forth, which I think is pretty far off in the future. That's kind of the fascinating stuff to me. But the more mundane yet real aspects of nanotech is in the medical field and in the material field, things that resist water, things that allow you to see through them. So like cloaking devices and things like that. As you mentioned, putting a antidote into a cell to kill cancer cells. Ultimately, if you think about where we're going, if you can actually program little devices to go in there and clean things up and target the bad cells and kill them or whatever, that's a really incredible technology. So yeah, it's very very much at the early stages, but has such great promise for cleaning up the oceans, cleaning up the atmosphere, and curing diseases.
Was it the book Engines of Creation?
That's the one, Engines of Creation. Yep.
Okay. Yeah, that's incredible. I remember that movie that came out in the 60s, I think, or maybe even before that, but they did a remake.
Fantastic Voyage?
Well, that not that one is the one I was thinking about.
Okay.
It was the Grey Goose stuff that was basically taking over everything and rewriting stuff to where it just turned into dust because it was doing it at the quantum level. The Day the Earth Stood Still, the remake of that is what I was thinking, that Grey Goo nanotech. And it's fascinating stuff indeed. Now, the AI thing is also very incredible, in my opinion. Just leaps and bounds how far advanced that's getting right now. Do you think that is kind of what the makeup of this universe is, some type of AI behind the scenes to kind of keep it constructed together?
Well, yeah, I guess, what is, it comes down to the definition of what artificial is. Artificial kind of implies that it's man-made or something, that it's not infused with life, perhaps. I'm not sure. I mean, there are a lot of definitions of artificial, I suppose. But, I do think that AI is, I think we overestimate it a little bit. Like, I don't think we're going to have Skynet anytime soon. I don't think that a general replication of a human is possible anytime soon. AI is great for solving very specific problems and learning from things like playing chess or playing Go, or whatever. But it's not even close to emulating a human brain at this point. Yeah, we'll probably get there, I imagine. But at that point, I still doubt that it would really be alive in the sense, or conscious in a sense, unless we as a conscious entity that exists elsewhere decide, okay, it might be interesting to occupy that AI and see what it's like to to experience, being in a silicon body or something like that. But that would be up to our consciousness. I don't think it's going to emerge from a sufficiently complex machine. I think, machines at their core are still deterministic, as is the internet. I mean, people talk about, is the internet conscious? Because it's so complex. It's roughly as complex as the human brain. It can learn. Things. There are things called neural nets that learn, but ultimately, even neural nets are deterministic, and you can trace back how they evolve through a logical construct.
And another thing too is there's so many different experiences people have when they meditate oftentimes, or, you've got the shamans that take peyote sometimes and other opiates, mind altering drugs, kind of alternate realities. And I was wondering if you could talk to us a little bit about that and, how you feel it kind of adds to this theory of the, kind of the simulated universe, basically.
Sure. I think that a lot of that is those are really valid experiences. I've actually had a couple myself. I used to meditate more than I do now. I've kind of lost the practice a little bit, and I'd love to get back into it. But I also use these tapes or these audios called Gateway series that came from the Monroe Institute, if you're familiar with that.
Oh, yeah.
And yeah, they put you in a very different state, and I actually did go out of body a couple times, which was super cool. So it kind of validated some of the things. We're funny. People are funny. We can hear 1,000 people say they've had an experience, and we say, that's BS until we actually have it ourselves.
Right.
So yeah, I think there's a lot of validity to the idea that when people are going out of body, they are going outside of this quote reality learning lab, this physical program that we're in, and they're connecting more purely with other conscious entities, or with the greater whole, with the greater construct. It's why people see white lights when they die, why they see their deceased loved ones. Those deceased loved ones aren't playing in the reality anymore. They're off somewhere else, or their model is off in this kind of astral plane, if you want to call it that. So I think those things, as new agey as they sound, the fact that they're so consistent across cultures and across experiences and across time indicates that there really is something there, and so you have to pay attention to them. And so I think it's it's good evidence for a consciousness-driven reality.
Right. Well, and as far as a conscious driven reality goes, it seems like there's code in everything, whether it be the trees, nature. There's always some type of number sequence, sacred geometry, etc. I was wondering if you could talk to us about that and how you've been able to intertwine those connections.
Well, there is, and that's interesting. One of the categories of evidence that I talk about in the book and on my website is the idea of equations creating reality. And this is the opposite of what we normally think of. Before, I talked about models, and equations are just models. They're just things that, they're mathematical constructs that we put together to explain the things that we observe. So it's the stuff that we observe that comes first. The reality comes first, and then we create equations to model them. But there have been at least two cases where it seems to go the other way around. So one of them is that if you remember back from algebra days, when you take the square root of a negative number, you end up with these quote imaginary numbers. Again, it was just a model, but Maxwell's equations have negative frequency solutions because of that idea. And we're taught in college and math classes and physics classes, well, you throw away the negative things, the negative frequency things, or the imaginary things, because they can't exist in the real world. But it turns out that those negative frequencies also have artifacts that are generated by the negative frequencies that are observed in the real world. So it's like kind of two levels removed. So in a sense, the imaginary or the negative frequency solutions to Maxwell's equations reveal themselves in our physical reality. And so it's almost like the equation is there first, and then we observe things from that. It doesn't make sense in the other direction. It doesn't, solutions to equations should only make sense in the context of describing reality, but it seems to be the other way around. It's like they create the reality. And the other one is a thing called Drinkas by a physicist named James Gates. I think he's from University of Maryland. And he noticed that there were error correction codes in the theory in string theory or in some supersymmetry theories of physics. What are error correction codes? Well, when you play a DVD or a CD, if there's a scratch on it, you actually lose some data, right? You lose, some of the frames of the video or some of the, parts of the music or whatever, and that would create a pop or some blank part on the screen or whatever. Except that what happens is there are error correction codes that go along with it. So when the player is reading all of this data and it realizes that some data is missing, the error correction code allows it to put the missing data back together. These codes are also used in transmitting things. So if you you go to an ATM and you send your bank account information, you enter a transaction, and that has to go to some server somewhere. Well, they better do that pretty accurately, but the communication channel could be noisy and they could flip a bit, and all of a sudden now you have zero balance in your account. Well, there's a lot of error correction codes that go in these transmission channels as well to correct for that. But that's a human construct. Error correction codes is a human construct, and for Gates to be finding evidence of these kinds of codes in these patterns of physics is also pretty remarkable. It's almost like the physics has error correction codes in there to make reality work.
Now, do you think that there's ever times that the Matrix kind of glitches, and that might be explain some of the phenomenons and stuff that take place?
Yeah, I suppose I don't know if I'd call it a glitch. I kind of feel like this, matrix, if you want to call it that, is so highly evolved and so sophisticated that there isn't too much that it's not like it's going to crash, or it needs an update, or that it's going to glitch like a normal computer does. That said, I think it's following a model of what you might call continuous improvement. So it's sort of like an evolutionary model. When cells evolve or when species evolve, they're faced with two paths, and if a mutation goes down one path and it causes the individual to have a less profitable outcome, more likely to be killed or whatever, that species isn't going to evolve that way. But in the other path, if the mutation does make them better, more fit in some way, then it will evolve in that way. So I think reality is probably working the same way, that there's always, some evolutionary things going on, and some of those things may manifest themselves in weird glitchy type behaviors. I don't know if you remember, not too long ago, there was this something that went around the internet about the Berenstain Bears. Have you heard of this?
There's the Bernstein and the one that was spelled differently, like it was an altered timeline or something.
Yeah, exactly. And so, I mean, I asked a lot of my friends, and they all remembered it being spelled one way, but it's all spelled a different way. It's spelled Bernstein now, Stain. And nobody, well, not nobody, some people do remember that, including the founders of the idea. But most people remember it being Stein. So
Right.
what could have happened here? That could be an example of a glitch where the system corrected itself by changing all of the artifacts on the web and everybody's memories and things like that, but it didn't quite get them all. It left our memories intact for some reason. I don't know why. Maybe it's it's an experiment, or it's to give us a clue that reality is malleable. I don't know, but that's I think maybe one of the best examples of a glitch.
That could be a possibility, or maybe there's a way to kind of change the timeline, alter history. Do you think that time travel is possible?
That's a good question. I mean, it's definitely, possible in the relativistic sense. If you travel at high speeds, you are effectively traveling. I forget whether it's into the past or into the future, but what would it mean to time travel into the past if you could? Tom Campbell says that everything that has ever happened, there's an archive of it. There's a record of that, and not just everything that has happened, but also a lot of potential scenarios that could have played out from each one of those. So if there's an archive of it, theoretically, our consciousness could go into that archive and go back and experience it, which would appear, for all intents and purposes, like time travel. But I don't know if that's the same way that people think of time travel.
Okay. Now, also, as far as some of the PSI stuff, the mental abilities some have, like being able to read people's minds sometimes, do you think that that might all be also kind of backing up this theory of this simulation because you're just reading information that's already there?
Absolutely, absolutely. And you know, the skeptics say that these subtle things don't exist, and you know, I think that's just ludicrous. I've known people and I've witnessed people who have had these abilities, these mind reading abilities, and things like that, and it's not a fluke. And the data is actually very, very good. Who is the gentleman that did a meta-analysis of all of the telepathy experiments, these Gansfield experiments? I forget who it is at the moment, but he determined that to an incredibly high likelihood. I mean, the error bar in this is like 1 in a million or 1 in a billion. That it was due to chance. That there really is an effect. There really is a telepathy effect. There's a remote viewing or clairvoyance effect. There's even precognition effect. So what could explain these? Well, the telepathy effect could be something as simple as, my conscious entity that's out in the cloud there interacting directly through some data transfer with another conscious entity that's out in the cloud and not going through our reality space. That could account for telepathy, or it could be going through the reality space and looping back to the actual consciousness. No reason why it couldn't. No reason. It's all part of the same data space, and so therefore the paths are there. Why aren't they there all the time? Well, it'd be crazy if they were there all the time. You could hear everything that everybody was thinking. You'd go nuts, and also probably wouldn't believe in the solidity of your reality, which is important again for learning and evolving your consciousness. But yeah, that could explain telepathy. And then the remote viewing thing is having some sort of leaky data into some object that is remote in the virtual world, what we call the physical world, but it's truly virtual. It's remote, but it's just another data stream. When we look at something, what is that? It's a data stream. You look at a lamp, you're getting, photons from that lamp are, hitting your eyes, and they're triggering, synapses and your visual cortex, and transmitting data to the brain to be interpreted. That's just data. So there's no reason why you couldn't be receiving data from something that you're not getting through your sense of sight or your sense of sound, your normal five senses. It could be coming in through a quote extrasensory channel.
Right, absolutely. And you also talk about the universe in your book, The Universe Solved. There's so many different theories about how old it is, how it was created, the Big Bang theory. What's your take on it?
Yeah, that's a good one. I mean, I think that it's one of two things happened. That it all played out the way science tells us that it played out, but it's again playing out into a 13.7 billion year long virtual reality. Very well could be that's what happened, and maybe it's that that reality evolved as our consciousnesses evolved. So we started out being the conscious entity that could occupy an atom, or plasma, and eventually we were the conscious entity that could occupy a bacteria, and then single-celled animals and fish and so forth, on up to complex humans, whales and everything else. So our consciousness and the way that it aggregated may have evolved as this universe evolved, the universe being the virtual reality digital construct, the kind of matrix. So that's possible. The other possibility is that it didn't happen that way, and it just started at some point. There's a theory called last Thursdayism, which is the idea that last Thursday is when the whole reality started, and all of the artifacts that are memories implanted in everybody's conscious mind, and all the artifacts on the web and books and everything else, were all planted there last Thursday to be consistent with each other and to make us feel that we have this consensus reality. Philosophically, you can't argue with it. Philosophically, that's possible. There's no way to prove that didn't happen. I mean, it seems ludicrous for sure, but maybe it wasn't last Thursday. Maybe it was a million years ago.
Absolutely. Now, you also talk about how there could be multiple universes. Now, I've never been able to grasp the theory as to the data to present it? I mean, I can obviously understand there being multiple universes, but the actual data where somebody can say, well, this is why there's a good possibility there are many universes. Is there a way that you could describe it for me?
Well, this is a really it's a can of worms, to be honest, because the idea of multiple universes or parallel realities is means different things to different people. And there's a mathematician, scientist named Max Tegmark that did a real good job of categorizing them in different ways. So there's one kind of multiple universe that says that when the Big Bang happened, all that was a bubble, which was a part of a, much bigger construct that had all these bubbles popping off of it in a fractal kind of way. And each one of those bubbles is a universe. And so they're all parallel to each other in that sense. We can never travel between one and the other because we're confined to our bubble. So it's hard to prove that something like that exists. Another idea is that we're only able to see what they call the Hubble volume, that the universe could be so much massively bigger than what we can see, but we're limited by the speed of light to only be able to look back, 13 billion years effectively, to that distance. But it could have been evolving, much, much bigger. So in that theory, you have a doppelganger. If the universe is truly infinite, if it's truly infinite, every combination of atoms exists in multiple places. So there's a Rex somewhere else, and there's a Jim somewhere else. Again, you can't get to them, but you could also consider those parallel realities. Now, there is some evidence that because of what they call the homogeneity of space of the universe, that it seems to imply that that the physical universe is much bigger than we're able to see, because it should be lumpier, essentially. It's kind of like, if you mix some things together and didn't stir it up real well, it would be lumpy. But if it's stirred up well, it kind of implies that it's been stirred for a long time. It's probably not a good way to explain it, but the idea is that there is actual evidence that seems to imply that the universe is much bigger than it is. So that type of parallel reality, there's some evidence for. Then there's another type, which is the quantum mechanics type. One of the theories of quantum mechanics is that something called the many worlds theory, and that goes a little like this, that every time a decision is made at the quantum mechanical level, so whether a particle goes in this direction or goes in that direction or has this spin or that spin, it actually splits off a whole new universe, one universe that has that one spin, and another universe that has the opposite. And so a zillion of these universes are getting split off and created at every instant, and they're all considered parallel universes too. This is a crazy idea, and actually I kind of invoke Occam's razor, which is, William Occam, a Dutch philosopher from way back in the day, had this idea that if you're presented with a bunch of theories, the simplest one is most likely the one that's true. These things like Hilbert space and these, many worlds theory, they're just so ludicrous that I think my theory, the consciousness-driven digital reality theory, is much more manageable and realistic. So, and it explains a lot more stuff than the other one does. So those are just some examples of parallel realities. Another parallel reality could be, if you've ever played World of Warcraft or any of those games, you're kind of in a reality space playing along with other players who have avatars and so forth. But there could be another computer server somewhere else that's hosting another 5,000 players in a parallel reality. You see what I mean? So you're playing the same game, but you're interacting with different people now, because they're put on a different server. So in a digital reality like a matrix, there could be a bunch of matrices running in parallel.
How far do you think somebody could actually go in rewriting the code with their mind? Kind of like the Matrix again. Let's jump back into that movie for a moment. Can somebody go out and go full Neo?
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. That's a great question. I think the system probably has some limitations on the ability to mold it, and right now those limitations appear to be, entanglement and calling particles into existence and things like that, which is very microscopic and very difficult to observe. But then you talk about things like The Secret or the power of the placebo or the power of positive thinking, and how that also seems to impact your reality. I remember reading an article once about a martial artist who broke his the bones in his hand in like 100 places, and the doctors thought he would never be able to use his hand again. And so what he did was every night when he went to bed, he would visualize this little factory in his hand working to, tie all the tendons together and repair all the damage and so forth. And that interaction with his mind and his physical body, which I say is just a data template, made a huge difference. The doctors were astounded at how well he recovered, but he recovered too well. And his hand was so stiff he could barely move the fingers. He did too good of a job of using his mind to heal himself. So what he did after that was he imagined the same kind of little factory, but all these little guys were in there with little oil cans, lubing up his joints and things like that. And then he got, his full motion of his hand back. So, that's an example of where, our mind can make changes to at the macroscopic level. And so is it Neo-like? Not quite, but it's healing, and that's a pretty significant change. I think that we're kind of at the infancy of learning how to do that. I read something, or I heard one of the remote viewers, one of the SRI remote viewers, McMonagle or one of those guys, talking about how the very first set of students they had, it took maybe, I don't know, months for them to learn the techniques. But then a couple generations later, it took them just weeks to get equally good. So it seems like there's something going on where the learnings that we have we're able to tap into learnings that other people have, or over time, those learnings create new templates in the reality that we can make use of. So I think in things like, healing or superhuman efforts or remote viewing or those kinds of things, that we're just learning how to tap into that stuff. And I'm not sure where the limit is, but there probably are some limitations by the system. But I think we still have a long way to go.
It'd be neat is if obviously they've been able to break down DNA and find certain genome sequences and stuff. If everything's information and sequence of numbers, then you could basically heal or cause certain opportunities or ailments or anything if you had these certain data packets that could just basically overlay the other information. So, that could be the future of warfare, the future of mind control, the future of medicine, if you could find some way to break down that in an information level.
Yeah, I hear that, and I think that's a really interesting idea, and it brings up the whole idea of can we use these powers for good or for evil? Tom Campbell talks about the bigger system, the the sort of the global consciousness as being dispassionate. It kind of doesn't care what we do or how we use it or how we interact with it. Its objective is to constantly evolve. So it's evolving through experiments. So if we do something that is evil in a sense, we figure out how to mind control the rest of the world. That's not evolving consciousness at all. It's going in the opposite direction. So that would probably bring about either an end to the experiment pretty quickly, or there would be some other aspect of it that would recognize that that's not a good evolutionary path, and therefore we need to move in another direction. So I think that even in this, some people accuse me of being like overly optimistic about things, but I kind of feel like even when there are technologies or ideas that can be used for good or evil, both paths get explored, but the evil path never seems to completely take over. So take nuclear energy or nuclear power, for example. We were 2 seconds or 2 minutes to doomsday back in the 60s, but we never got there. And population explosion in the 70s was supposed to destroy the planet, and now global warming is supposed to destroy the planet. And there have always been these apocalyptic views of of our future, but for some reason they never come to fruition. Same thing with nanotech or cloning. Almost any new technology has a downside, has a potential dangerous side. And I'm not saying that they don't create catastrophes at times, but on the whole, they tend to even out, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, that yin yang, the balance, the duality, there's definitely something that seems to keep a specific harmony. And I think that's interesting that you bring that up. I've talked to other people that say there is no right and wrong, there just is. Yet you know what's right and wrong because your conscience tells you, in my opinion. I mean, if you're hurting somebody, that's not right. And it's just interesting how people come up with different ideas and stuff. But I really love how you just said, okay, if everything's trying to take control and mind control everybody, well, that's not going to cause the evolution of consciousness. Quite the opposite, actually. And this super entity, this super being, whatever it is, doesn't really look at things as good and bad, but it does more so as evolution. I think that's a really powerful statement.
Yeah, I think so too. And I've been trying to figure out a way to put some math behind it. Like, if you kind of look at things statistically and say, well, here's a bunch of technologies that had just as much likelihood of going south as they did going north, and they didn't. And what's the likelihood that that happened? Is that evidence for a larger consciousness? I don't know. It's just another avenue of inquiry I never got to, but I think I would love to see somebody do something about that.
Now, what's your definition of the soul, Jim?
Well, so I think the soul is synonymous with the conscious entity, quote, mind, individuated consciousness, whatever we want to call it, that's out there in the global consciousness space or in all that there is. That's the core thing, and I think that does live on, and it probably evolves, and it may expand or contract at times. But yeah, that's what I would say the soul is. And there's some interesting areas. There's another area that I've researched a little bit. I just don't have time to research all of these, but the whole idea of nature versus nurture. In cases, they've done these studies of identical twins brought up in the same environment, so they have the same environment, so they have the same nurture side, and they have the same nature side because their genetics are almost identical, and yet they're very different people. They have different senses of values. It's baffling to psychologists, but it's not baffling if you recognize that those are just two completely independent souls that have a sense of right and wrong, or different values, or maybe have different ages. You hear about old souls and new souls. It could very well be due to that the decisions that people make have less to do with their environment and their genetics, and more to do with the history of their soul.
That's an interesting possibility, and I've heard of similar theories and ancient texts talk about stuff like that. Now, I wonder, though, where the soul actually comes from. What do you think God or divine providence is?
I think it's a connection to the global consciousness. It's a connection to the big system. It's a recognition that you're not a separate entity, that it's lights out when you die. So, having that connection is that a feeling of, what some people would call divine. I've had that experience when I meditate, that I feel a very different feeling. It's a really positive feeling. It's not something that I normally experience in day-to-day life. I can't put a finger on it, but it feels like a connection to something. And so, that in a small way, it's probably like a little bit of a divine spark. It's a little bit of that connection to the greater consciousness.
Okay. Now, and do you think that Ray Kurzweil was accurate when he said that the singularity is going to happen within the next 40 years?
No, I don't. Again, I think that taking Moore's law, which applies to transistors on a chip, and saying that artificial intelligence will follow the same pattern, just don't think that makes sense. I think artificial intelligence has a lot, a lot to do with understanding how the human mind does, and that is we're certainly not making leaps and bounds of knowledge and how the human mind works enough to program an AI, and increasingly at Moore's law rate. So I don't think that's going to happen at all in 37 years, or whenever that date is. The other thing that I think is flawed about his thinking, with all due respect, I mean, he's a very bright guy, clearly, but he has this idea of living long enough to live forever, and becoming immortal through taking pills, repairing DNA, whatever. And I just think that's also flawed thinking if you believe, as I do, that we're already immortal. Our consciousness is already immortal. I do believe the evidence is strong that there is an idea of reincarnation. So why extend your life beyond its normal, um, its normal time? If you're in a sense, you're doing yourself a disservice because if the purpose of life is to learn lessons, you learn some lessons at a steep curve when you've got all your faculties. As you get old, you don't learn that many lessons anymore, so it's time to reincarnate and learn some new lessons. But if you just extend that, your soul is probably evolving at a slower rate.
It's interesting what some people want to do with their consciousness, or they think that they can download it onto a computer and then live on the World Wide Web, kind of like the movie Lawnmower Man that came out in the early
Hmm.
90s. And
Yep.
it's interesting. I would think that would be more of like an imprisonment, because if you're confined within a microchip, what's that going to be like? I mean, that's
I know.
no
Yeah, I,
thanks.
I certainly don't want to be the first human to go through a transporter or to try to upload, their consciousness onto a chip or something like that. Somebody else can do that. I'll stick with, normal life and death. Thank you.
Right. Valhalla.
Right.
Man, that would be an interesting way. I don't think, the traditional bury people in a coffin and then, now why not go out on a boat, man, and just light it up,
Exactly. Right.
blaze of glory. Now you
Yeah,
talk about,
I've always said if I'm going to die, I want to die being eaten by a shark or jumping out of a plane or something significant, as opposed to just like slowly degrading.
something exciting. Yeah, definitely.
Yep.
Nice. Now you talk about little green men and extraterrestrials and stuff. What's your take on the ET phenomenon?
Well, yeah, that one we talked a little earlier about metaphysical anomalies and things that don't adhere to standard laws of physics and stuff like that, but that can exist in the space. And I think that's probably what explains these. I think there really is something going on. I don't believe for a minute that there are aliens in tin cans that fly across the galaxy. But I think that people do have these abduction experiences, and there's a lot of consistency in the kinds of experiences that they have as well, which is another reality that they're in. They're interacting with some entity that exists in this reality learning lab that we have. It's just not in our normal space of normalcy, or whatever you want to call it. It's not in the the day-to-day things that we see. There's something else going on there. I don't know what the purpose is, but it's certainly explainable in a consciousness-driven digital reality. Those things could be what they called in the Matrix. I forget the name. Like I said, like an autonomous program. They may not be connected to an individuated consciousness. It may be an AI or something within our reality learning lab. Don't know. It's certainly a mystery, and it would certainly take a lot more kind of research and thinking to make much conclusion out of it. But I don't discount it at all. It seems like there's a lot of evidence for the experiences that people have, and actually, all we have is experience. That's all we know is experience. We don't know anything else when you get right down to it. All that we can know for sure is that we're having experiences.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And you also talk about the type 1 civilization transitioning to a type 2 and then 3, etc. And I've obviously heard that, Michael talk a lot about in order to get to that level, if we go that far, then we can basically harness the power of the stars and stuff like that. But is that actually going to be something that you think the human beings will be able to get to that level? Or like you said, it doesn't really matter anyway because we are immortal at a conscious level.
Yeah, I think that's an artifact of the Cold War. To be honest, the whole idea of type 1, type 2, type 3 civilizations is based on the premise that we want to have all this energy to be able to control our solar system or control our galaxy or whatever. I don't know that we really want to do that. Why do we want to control that? Why do we want to tap into the energy of the sun? Do we really think we're going to be immortal for the next 6 billion years or whatever lifetime there is left in the sun? I don't know. It just doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me. I think it's the idea of it is an artifact of the time when we were more imperialist in mentality, and we're not so much anymore. I mean, the whole economy is moving to more a shared economy model. Imperialism is not a good word anymore. And I think the evolution of our consciousness is more about getting in touch with the true nature of our consciousness rather than controlling things in this apparent physical realm. So, let's take another example is things don't take the energy that they used to. Our technology's evolved to the point where as we get more sophisticated, we don't need the level of energy that we used to need. So I think part of the theory of the Kardashev civilizations was that, if you follow Moore's law and you followed how fast humans were growing in terms of their consumption of energy and consumption of electricity, that, extrapolating that into the future implied that we're going to have to harness the energy of the sun and eventually the energy of the galaxy. But it turns out that wasn't the case. We've flattened out, maybe even gone down in terms of our need for energy per capita. So I just don't think that model even makes much sense.
Okay. And then there's and there's one thing that you do say that I think is very interesting, or that you quote in the book. Either we are currently living in non-simulated reality and will fail to reach post-human status, or we have already reached it and are living in a simulation. So do you think that that's where we are, post-human status?
Oh yeah, this is Nick Bostrom's idea. I mean, this is one of the things that kind of, kicked off the whole simulation idea, got everybody's imagination going. And it was interesting that he wrote the original one. I think if you go to his paper, by the way, he's a philosopher from Oxford, and he has a site and a paper called The Simulation Argument. But if you go there, I think it dates it back to 2001 or 2003, but it was really earlier than that. Because I remember reading it in 1999, which is the same year that The Matrix came out and The 13th Floor and all these other things. So it was almost like there was this whole, confluence of ideas of simulation at the same time. But anyway, what Bostrom's idea is that it's just a logical argument. And the logical argument goes like this. We are creating fantasy worlds. We're creating alternate realities that are very immersive. We do this in the video games we play and in simulators and things like that. And they get more and more immersive to the point where pretty soon they'll be indistinguishable from reality. And when will that happen? Is it 20 years, 30 years? It almost doesn't matter. The logic still says that we're going to get to that point. And he calls that a post-human point. Post-humanism being the idea that you can create your own realities and experience it. And it's indistinguishable from a, pre-post-human reality, if you will. So the argument goes that we're going to get there. So either we don't get there because we destroy ourselves before we get there, or we consciously decide not to pursue that, avenue of tech, which I think you can throw that one out, because when do we not pursue something that seems cool?
Right.
Or we
Or
really
dangerous.
right, or we really are in the state before getting to that post-human state. So the options are, we destroy ourselves, or we're living in, we really are before that state, and we destroy ourselves before we get there, which is a very pessimistic point of view, or we have already gotten there and we're living, and because the likelihood is that when we get there, we're going to create billions of these simulations. So the odds that we're living in one of those is much higher than the odds that we're living in the only reality that exists before the post-human state. So his logical argument is that we're almost certainly living in a simulated reality. It's kind of hard to argue with it, but I've read some other arguments that get pretty deep philosophically that do find flaws in that, and then I've read counter arguments to that. It's an interesting thing, but I think as a bit of evidence for us being in reality, that's a bit of interesting philosophical evidence.
Absolutely. Do you think we live in kind of a cosmic version of the Truman Show?
Yeah, probably in a sense. I don't know that there's a God like there was in the Truman Show. I think again, all that there is probably dispassionate and driven by a rule of continuous improvement or evolution. But essentially, it's a reality that we're playing in to learn, and so that's Truman Show is a little bit more sort of solipsistic or something. Everybody else in the show was aware of the game, and Truman wasn't. I don't think that's the case here. I think we're all not aware of the game.
Right. Right. It's interesting. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on, and you've got a great blog, I must say, over at theuniversesolved.com. You talk about science, philosophy, program reality, future tech, physics, cosmology, quantum mechanics, life, consciousness. So just a bounty of intel. And I really appreciate the way that you put it together. You've got so much good information. You put it together eloquently so everybody can understand it in an exciting manner. And what's this new book that you're coming out with? When will it be available?
Oh, I'm so far behind on that. I was hoping to get it done by the end of last year, and now I'm targeting the end of this year. I'd say it's like two-thirds done. Don't really have a working title for it yet, so I'd say probably another 6 months. Got to shop for a publisher and all that kind of thing. But it's going to be like the first book, but on steroids. It's going to deal a lot more with the conscious side of things and models that explain everything. And whereas the first book had, say, 4 categories of evidence for digital reality, this book has dozens of categories of evidence. Every time I turn around, I'm finding another category. I think by the time you read that, you're going to be almost convinced that that we do live in a consciousness-driven digital reality. So yeah, so I'm probably 6 months to a year.
Okay. Yeah, fantastic. This has been great. Really appreciate you coming on the show with us here at the Leak Project.
Oh, awesome, Rex. Really, an interesting hour and a half. You asked some awesome questions, and it was really a really good time.
Oh, this has been great. Certainly a fascinating topic, and hope that we can get you back on when you finish up your next book. Would love to put it on our website for you. Folks, make sure to check out our website. This thing is cutting edge, leakproject.com. Also, pick up a copy of The Universe Solved over at theuniversesolved.com and be the change you want to see. This is Rex Bear. Good night. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us this edition of Leak Project. I am your host, Rex Bear, and we have guest Jim Elvidge with us, an electrical engineer, author, researcher, holding 4 patents. Now, behind and beyond the high-tech realm, Mr. Elvidge has years of experience as a musician, writer, and truth seeker. He merged his technology skills with his love of music, developed one of the first PC-based digital music samplers, and co-founded Radio Amp, the first private label online streaming radio company. And for many years, Mr. Elvidge has kept pace with the latest research, theories, and discoveries in the varied fields of subatomic physics, cosmology, artificial intelligence, nanotechnology, and the paranormal. This unique knowledge has provided the foundation for his first full-length book, The Universe Solved. Pick up your copy today at theuniversesolved.com. Hey, Jim, it's great to have you on the show with us here at the Leak Project. How the heck are you?
Thank you very much, Rex. Great to be on the project. I'm doing great, and really looking forward to our conversation tonight.
Absolutely. I was telling you a little bit before the show started, I've always been a big fan of the possibility of this specific reality that we're in being a type of simulation, almost like virtual reality. And I'll just give you games and just thinking, man, what is this going to be like 10 years down the road, 20 years down the road, 30 years down the road? And then when the virtual reality stuff got out there, I had access to some specific VR, and just the possibilities I realized were incredible. And I thought, is this what the future of our life is going to be like? Similar to that movie that Bruce Willis was in, also the Avatar film. You look at sacred geometry and other things. There's just so many things that point to the possibility of this being a simulation. So I'm certainly just feel honored to have you on the show, and I know that our listeners are going to be enthralled in this information. And if you could just give us a brief description about yourself and background, and then we'll segue into The Universe Solved.
Okay, sure. I really do appreciate the interest in the area, and sometimes I wonder if we're thinking about this and all of this interest now in the simulated theories and simulism and so forth. I have to do with the fact that there is virtual reality out there, that we do have fantasy games that we can play that are very immersive and almost indistinguishable from reality. And we start thinking, well, what if our reality is like that? How much of it is, kind of the tail wagging the dog, so to speak, or how much of it is really real? So I've always got that in the back of my head when I think about these things and when I do research, trying to make sure that I'm not coming to conclusions through the lens of the technology that we have today. But, it has just opened up those possibilities and leads to some kind of interesting logical arguments too. So yeah, okay, a little bit about me. electrical engineering. My focus area in school was digital signal processing, which was kind of interesting because that's a lot about what we talk about here. And my day job is something very different. I do leadership coaching and agile coaching, helping high tech companies be more efficient and be more empowered and things like that. But this side project of the universe solved and the book that I'm working on now, there's a second book, has really been my passion. So I've been researching this for many years and kind of keeping up with other people who have been researching this. We've been in touch, and back in the days when I came out the book, it's not that long ago, back in 2008, there were only 3 or 4 of us, and now there are probably hundreds who are talking about this concept and coming at it from different angles. So in a way, it's really good to see kind of mainstream science considering this seriously and jumping on the bandwagon. So that's an interesting development.
That's right. I do remember reading a headline of an article, and it was on one of the more popular news channels talking about the scientists came out and said that we're most likely in some type of simulation. Yeah, that's interesting. Now, let's go to the heart of the matter then. What would make the first step that would make somebody go, wow, there is certainly a possibility that this isn't just what I thought it was growing up or what I was told?
Well, the first step is actually probably the biggest and most important one, but it's not for the faint of heart. It's the researching quantum mechanics. It's a field of science that was essentially one of the 2 revolutionary fields of physics in the 20th century, relativity being the other one. Relativity was all about what happens at very high speeds and how space is warped and time is dilated and all these kind of things. And Einstein was a genius for coming up with that theory and the implications of it. And it's been proven out over and over again to be a very accurate and solid theory. The other one being quantum mechanics. And quantum mechanics, in contrast, is focusing on the very small, what happens at very tiny scales. And very early on, there was a lot of debate about, is our space quantized? Is time quantized? Do things kind of chunk along and, in little units of time? And scientists, split camps. There were some that believed, no, space is continuous and time is continuous. And then there were others that said, no, maybe not. Maybe there is some kind of digital nature to it. So there have been a lot of experiments developed to kind of probe the nature of reality. And the main one is a class of experiments called the double slit experiment. And the fascinating thing about this experiment is that the result of the experiment, the outcome of it, is a pattern on a screen. And that pattern changes depending on whether or not you observe it. So that sort of implies that the observer, the conscious entity that is watching this experiment, is interacting with it in some way. The very fact that it's observing causes reality to change, or actually causes something to come into reality. So this has been a baffling idea for years, and there have been no end of interpretations of quantum mechanics, 15, 20 different ones that have tried to explain this away. And over the years, different experiments get better and better and rule out all of the kind of continuous reality, deterministic reality possibilities, until we're now left with some experiments that don't actually determine the direction that these particles go until after the pattern is created, and that determination then effectively changes the pattern. So it's impossible for the observer to interfere with the experiment. It's just noticed afterwards. So there's an experiment called the delayed choice quantum eraser experiment, which pretty much puts a nail in the coffin of determinism and deterministic reality. And what it means is, the real aha moment is, oh my gosh, we're actually creating our reality. And that old thing where they say, if a tree falls in the forest, does it make a sound? According to quantum mechanics, no, it doesn't. You have to have an observer there to notice anything at all. So that's really the astounding result. And there are a lot of other categories of evidence, which I talk about in the book and talk about in my new book and on my blog as well. But that double slit experiment, the quantum mechanics results, those are the things that generate the headlines that say we must be living in a simulated reality.
It's interesting you say there has to be an observer for something to take place, essentially. And everything alive is observing to an extent with some type of sensory perception, whether it be a bug, plant. So I'm wondering then, if this quantum makeup that we're in, this matrix per se, kind of like the movie, this holographic soup, essentially we're all connected somewhere. So in this simulation, it's constantly running software basically, and that's kind of connected to our DNA. So is that how we basically see what we do through the software that's being immersed through the actual physical body?
Right. Really good question, and we're jumping right into it here. This is great. I'll back up just a second and say that there could be kind of two schools of thought on this simulation idea. One is that we're in one, playing it somehow, connected to it like an avatar, and we're just going along for the ride, and it's deterministic. The other school of thought is very different. It's the one that I subscribe to, which is it's not deterministic. It's our consciousness is elsewhere. Our consciousness doesn't emanate from the brain. It's somewhere else. So I believe from all of the evidence that I've collected and researched that what some of the ancient mystics said, being that we're all connected are into one global consciousness, some people might call it God, some people might call it the universe or universal consciousness or whatever, that we are all part of that. And a section of it defines each one of us. The bug, the human, whatever. There's a section of that thing, and you can think of it as having sort of a virtual wall around it that makes it individuated. That's our consciousness. That's our mind, and it's interacting most likely with another programmatic construct that's in this great big ball of consciousness as well. I call it all that there is. It's just digital stuff. So we interact with this other thing that has templates for humans and templates for brains and templates for bugs and cats and dogs and so forth. And we appear to connect to that and interact with reality in what we think of as physical reality in that way, but it's all very virtual. So that's what makes everything soft. We have, if you think about the nature of a reality, what is a reality? A reality is something that you experience, and people experience all kinds of realities. You experience a certain reality when you dream, but that's just you. That's one person. So a lot of people would say, "Oh, well, that's just a fantasy." Okay, fine. My mind is making that up, and I'm interacting in that world. That's fine. But over at the other extreme is what we call a very high consensus reality, and that's one where a lot of conscious entities, yourself, myself, all the people around us, are experiencing largely the same thing. We stand on a street corner and we watch a blue car go by and we all say, "Hey, that's blue. Is it blue to you?" "Yeah, it is. It's going pretty fast." We all kind of agree on what we see. But these experiments that I was talking about before are showing that in reality, we don't experience exactly the same thing. And we, create things. So there's this very complex thing going on with all of these consciousnesses experiencing things, and the kind of clay that is the digital reality responding accordingly. In the middle of that spectrum, I talk about the consensus reality at one end and the kind of individual reality of a dream state in the other end. There's actually other things in between. So like an out-of-body experience, there have been people who have had out-of-body experiences where they've interacted with other people having out-of-body experiences, written down what they saw, written down their interactions with each other, and found out that they were all consistent. Or people who have had mutual lucid dreams, which is very similar. So there's really a whole spectrum of types of reality, some low consensus, some high consensus. The fact that we're normally in this high consensus reality